Hi, I'm Austin Andrus, this is Ingenious Designs, and this piece of bookbinding leather was just a pain to purchase. I drove 2 hours to the nearest leather craft store, pawed through all the options, saw this in a sale bin, turns out it wasn't actually on sale, but at that point I wasn't going back empty-handed, and drove 2 more hours back home. It would have been a lot more convenient to just purchase it online. But with every leather hide being unique, could I really be sure it was perfect from pictures alone? Let's find out. Let's study the bookbinding leathers I have on hand and learn what they can teach us about making confident purchases online. Then we'll compare an online purchase against this hand-selected hide and see how it stacks up. The most important aspect of bookbinding leather is that it needs to be flexible enough to take on the shape of a book and to bend 180 degrees like a hinge. And to do that, it needs to be really thin. This is leather from a professional bookbinding supplier, and it's less than 1 millimeter thick. But leather usually isn't sold in thickness units of millimeters or inches. It's sold in ounces. I know, it's counterintuitive. Here's a conversion chart if you're interested, but the important thing to know is that the greater the number of ounces, the thicker the leather will be. Leather hides of 1.5 ounces or less are pretty consistently thin enough to bind books with, but you can get away with up to 2.5 ounces. I wouldn't go any thicker though. One way to make sure that your leather is thin and flexible enough is to get it from a thin-skinned animal. Sheep, goat, pig, and deer skin are all usually pretty thin and flexible, with goat skin being especially common among bookbinders. Calf skin and other cow leathers are naturally much thicker and more rigid. They can be skived down to be thinner, but I would still be careful with them. This is 2.5 ounce calf skin, and despite my best efforts, it's just too inflexible to function ideally in a book hinge. I would also avoid scaly exotic leathers like lizard, alligator, ostrich, or ray skin because the scales will resist bending. Sometimes you can tell how rigid a skin is just by looking at it. Take a glance at these two pictures. Which one seems more flexible? I bet you picked this one. But how did you know? Well, when this skin bends, it kinks at a few points like a garden hose, and that means it's about equally flexible. This one, however, bends and curves naturally at multiple points. Thankfully, many online sellers have pictures just like this to help you assess if the leather's right for you or not. And if you see a picture like this one, avoid it. You can tell that even under some weight, this leather couldn't be forced down into a tight crease. But what if you only have images of the leather lying flat? That can be trickier, but there are still some clues we can pick up. For example, leather is often stored rolled up. So if you see large ripples in one direction, that may mean that the hide didn't want to go back down flat after it had been rolled. Probably not flexible enough. On the other hand, a more supple leather will lie flat even after being rolled up, and if it does have wrinkles in it, you'll see them in multiple orientations. Even if a hide has the right consistency for bookbinding, that means very little if it's not the right size for the job. A lot of leather listings here on eBay will give you a square footage estimate, but I remain a little skeptical unless the description says the skin in the pictures is exactly the one that I will receive. I mean, the average book I make requires 1.4 square feet of leather, but even though these snake skins are technically bigger than that, they still won't fit my books. You want a hide that's as close to rectangular as possible, because these extra shoulder and hip areas usually end up as scrap. And watch out for any holes that might make an entire section useless. The last thing to consider is the surface texture of the leather. Now this may be a very important factor to you personally if you want a very specific look, but I don't have a lot of advice to offer on this subject because honestly, there just isn't a very agreed upon terminology for leather texture. Some would call this a pebbled grain, others would call it a flat grain, and some would insist that a leather's grain has nothing to do with the texture of the leather and everything to do with what part of the skin it came from. And most of these textures are just pressed into the leather anyway, in a process that could be called printing, imprinting, or embossing depending on who you ask. What I will say is there are a couple of leather finishes that I avoid. In the first place, very shiny, glossy patent leather finishes usually mean the leather is going to be stiffer than you want. Plus, although it's easy to take a dull leather and make it shinier, taking a shiny leather and making it duller can be difficult. I would also avoid any leather that's advertised as waxed or oiled. I personally apply most of my book cover art with heat transfer vinyl, and it just doesn't stick well to those finishes. With all these skills under our belt, we're ready to find some bookbinding leather online. Let's say I want the next book I bind to be black. Here on eBay, I would search for something like 1.5 ounce black sheepskin leather hide. Of course, I could search for different thicknesses, different types of skins, etc., but let's see how this search goes. It looks like there's some encouraging options here. This one seems thin, and the wrinkles going in multiple directions indicate that it's pretty flexible. But the tiny pebbled texture is pretty uninteresting, and we only have these two pictures to go off of, so let's see if we can do better. Now this one looks promising. This image shows me that the leather bends and folds well, and this one verifies that it is exactly 0.6 millimeters thick. And I absolutely love this texture. The only drawback is that this listing doesn't show me the exact hide I'll be getting, so I'm not sure about the shape, but at this price, I'm convinced enough. Let's buy it. And through the magic of editing, here it is, instantly in my hand. Let's see how it compares to the hand-picked hide I showed you earlier. These two were roughly the same price, but the eBay pick is slightly larger. I can't use 100% of the area since it has one useless flap in this corner, but this one also has a hole on the edge, so they're about equally useful. One is also just as thin as the other, and they both have a little stretch, just the way I like it. But where this hide really shines is its texture. It is absolutely beautiful to look at, and it feels so soft and supple. I would call this online purchase a huge success, but frankly, I'm not at all surprised by that. More than half of the bookbinding leathers in my collection have been purchased online, and I just wanted to make this video to share with you what I've learned so you can shop with the same confidence. Now, if you know much about leather, you may have noticed that I've avoided talking about one of the biggest controversies in the hobby, vegetable tan versus chrome tanned leather. That topic is big enough that it deserves a different video, which I'm working on right now. So stick around the channel and I'll be answering that question and many more very soon. See you there.